Okay, hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this, the second ever Heterodox Classics panel. This panel was slated to take place at the UK Classical Association meeting in Swansea in April this year, but obviously it didn't because of the measures that were taken in response to COVID-19. I think you might have recognized that, have realized that. So I'm grateful to Heterodox Academy for pointing out that we could actually do our papers anyway, and just circulate them online. So what I'm doing here is presenting my paper for that panel in the form it would have been presented at the conference. As you'll see, that form is that it's very much a work in progress. It's more ideas and preliminary findings towards a polished paper more than anything else. So if you have any comments or criticisms, please don't hesitate to post them in the comment section below the video. And obviously we'd love to have as good a discussion as we might have had in person in Swansea, but obviously now not in person but online. Okay, so speaking of having a good discussion, trying to make sure we keep on having good discussions in our field is one of the reasons Heterodox Classics was founded. And it might be good, since this is a Heterodox Classics panel, if I just very briefly told you what Heterodox Classics is. As I did at the beginning of my talk at our first panel at the Australasian Society for Classical Studies annual conference in Dunedin earlier this year. That was the inaugural Heterodox Classics panel. So Heterodox Classics is associated with Heterodox Academy, which is a consortium of academics who are keen to support and foster viewpoint diversity, respectful disagreement, and open discussions in universities. And I'll put the link to their website below the video. Now, we, Heterodox Classics, are one of their so-called heterodox communities, and our goal is to try to protect and advance the same aims as Heterodox Academy, but within classics. So open discussions, respectful disagreement, and viewpoint diversity. Now, part of our mission is to walk the walk ourselves and to try and bring fresh and different ideas to the field in a stimulating but also a good-natured way. And so that's why in the next, hopefully not much more than 20 minutes or so, I'm going to try and challenge a view that I see as becoming the accepted wisdom in Greek history, that Athens didn't promote democracy, or at least not in a significant way and not for ideological reasons. Some of the founders of Heterodox Academy, like John Haidt, are also interested in how the way we approach a question can influence how we answer it. And there may just be food for thought on that front in this case too, something I'll come back to at the end of this presentation. So older textbooks, as well as scholarly works, used to routinely assert that Athens promoted democracy abroad. That, to quote Anton Powell, writing in 1988, it undoubtedly promoted the creation or the strengthening of democracy in many other Greek cities. In more recent decades, scholars have become much more skeptical of claims like this, even to the point that it seems that someone arguing that Athens did protect and expand democracy abroad would now be arguing against prevailing scholarly opinion. This now prevailing opinion was maybe most clearly expressed and most carefully argued for by Roger Brock in his essay, Did the Athenian Empire Promote Democracy? A detailed essay, thoroughly grounded in the sources, which anyone interested in this topic should read. It can be found in the volume I've put on the screen. And if I can be allowed an anecdote, the expression of this view that sticks most in my mind was actually an exchange I had with my revered doctoral supervisor, Josh Ober. I remember trying to make a point about the role of democratic ideology in Athenian foreign policy, and Ober, as gently and kindly as ever, but also quite firmly, told me that there was no evidence that the Athenians sought to spread democracy abroad, obviously echoing what I have a sense is now the conventional view. Now, even by this point, you, who are, of course, a particularly sharp and intelligent listener, may have noticed that there are several slightly different claims that are being discussed here. One is that the Athenians deliberately promoted democracy abroad as a matter of ideology. Another is that they did so consistently. And actually, these last two claims might be related, since we might expect Athens to aim at some consistency in promoting democracy if they were reliably doing it as a matter of principle. But it's still useful to distinguish the different parts of that claim. And then there's also the question of what period we're concerned with. When people make these claims, what kind of time period do they have in mind? Is it just the 5th century empire, or is it the whole of the classical period, or indeed even beyond that? So Roger Brock, in the end, arrives at this formulation, that the foreign policy of the Athenian Empire was far from consistently democratic, yet at the same time it involved a substantial amount of support for democracy, though that support wasn't given with a consistent ideological commitment. So Brock focuses on the 5th century empire, but in other ways what he says isn't as far away as what I'm about to say as you might expect, which is another phenomenon that Heterodox Academy isn't interested in when you are arguing against someone and come to realize you're not as far apart as you might think. So what I'm going to try and show in this paper is simply that Athens was a major factor in the diffusion of Greek democracy, or the diffusion of democracy in the Greek world, in the late archaic and classical periods. And if we're talking about states, rather than, say, economic factors, Athens was probably the most influential polis in terms of the spread of democracy. Now, to what extent the Athenians did this as a matter of principle or of ideology, it's hard to nail down, considering the state of our sources, and that's not something I'll be able to decide beyond all doubt here. But if I'm right that Athens had such a major hand in the spread of Greek democracy, and if we bear in mind that ordinary Athenians, as opposed to elite historians and philosophers, seem to have been deeply imbued with democratic ideology, I would submit that it seems likely that ideological commitment played a significant role. Anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So, let me start by making a few points in response to Brock's article, which I'm taking as a worthy champion of the skeptical view. I'm obviously not going to have time in this talk to go through each of the many, often very interesting cases of regime change that Brock brings our attention to, or his many stimulating readings of individual passages from the sources. That's something I'm hoping to be able to do when I write this up as a proper paper. But I did want to note some key features of his argumentative strategy in this piece. One is to draw our attention to the historical context of many cases in which the Athenians prompted a change to a democratic regime. Another is to look at the rhetorical context surrounding statements that the Athenians promoted democracy in the sources, mostly 4th century sources. And a final feature is to note general trends, but to focus more on the exceptions, even to the point that the focus is shifted from where I will argue it might more naturally be placed. So the first feature of Brock's argument is most obvious in what he says about the Peloponnesian War. The first feature was the tendency, or the willingness to put historical cases of regime change into a larger context. And that's most clear in what he says about the Peloponnesian War, a conflict which involves a good number of apparently clear cases of cities turning democratic or oligarchic with Athenian or Spartan support, respectively. In the case of Corcyra, Brock points out acutely and correctly that Thucydides doesn't actually say Athens and Sparta wanted to intervene for ideological reasons, only that the local democratic leaders were ready to call in Athens and the local oligarchic leaders were ready to call in Sparta. But it's worth remembering that this wouldn't make any sense if there wasn't a justifiable expectation, which would become a not infrequent reality, that Athens and Sparta did in fact stand ready to support people within these city-states that were on the same side as them ideologically. Brock, as we've seen, is mainly interested in teasing out whether the Athenian Empire was a consistent promoter of democracy, and his point is that we shouldn't just retroject the kind of thing Athens was up to during the Peloponnesian War to the decades before it. Now that's absolutely a fair point, but it leaves us with the fact that Athens did often seem to play a pretty significant role in democratic revolutions during the Peloponnesian War. Clearly, in fact, the most significant single role of any polis. So Sparta may have been even more interested in regime change, but that was, of course, in an oligarchic direction, right? For example, in the last period of the Peloponnesian War. But Athens was paramount among the democracies in stimulating change in a democratic direction. So this also applies to Brock's comment on a passage in the treatise on the Athenian constitution by the so-called old oligarch, where he tells us that the Athenians choose the worst people, that is, the masses, in cities torn by civil strife. So the Athenians are siding with the lower classes. Now, Brock accepts this backs up the picture we have in Thucydides of Athens tending to side with the democratic lower classes in other Greek cities. But he then adds that This relates to conditions in the Peloponnesian War. Now, he's surely right that these conditions were unusual, but again, that doesn't mean that Athens wasn't supporting democracies in this period. In any case, most of the sources Brock looks at come from 4th century authors like Isocrates, so I'll turn a bit to those sources now, especially Isocrates. We should always be alert to speechwriters' larger argumentative claims, and Brock laudably points out, for example, that Isocrates in the Panegyricus is telling us that Athens promoted democracy in the 5th century as a way of making the Athenians sound better than Sparta, and so to help undermine Sparta's pretensions to be the paramount city in the Greek world. So that's his argumentative strategy. We need to bear that in mind. That's an obviously good point. But it's unlikely Isocrates would have included this argument at all if it was obviously made up, especially at a time when 5th century Athenian realities were much less distant than they are now. So it does make sense to draw attention to the ideological agendas in Isocrates' texts, and hence to bring up reasonable doubts as to whether he's exaggerating. If we put that now beside the relative silence of our main narrative source for the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides, we might well come away with the impression that there's just not much sound evidence that 5th century Athenians were interested in spreading democracy for ideological reasons. And that is indeed the conclusion that a lot of scholars seem to have come to. But I would suggest that that would be unbalanced in the sense that Thucydides himself has his own ideological predilections. We need to bear that in mind. In particular, and as a good deal of excellent scholarship has shown, Thucydides tends to view human behavior in austerely non-ideological terms. He sees human behavior as a product of basic drives like fear and the desire for power. So in the Mytilenean debate, for example, both Cleon and Diodotus argue virtually exclusively in suspiciously Thucydidean terms, right, in terms of what will most benefit Athens, even though nearly everything else we know about classical Athenian culture and oratory suggests that they would almost certainly have made appeals also to morality, emotion, religion, things like that. So if Thucydides rarely tells us that the Athenians are intervening in a city for high-minded democratic reasons, that may have more to do with the way Thucydides saw the world than what was actually going on. The final feature of Brock's article I wanted to raise is that though it often reaches laudably nuanced and careful conclusions from the evidence, it's usually possible to look at the evidence from a different, and I would argue more natural, perspective. So, for example, he argues that Athens didn't consistently try to install democracies against all the odds, but in fact, it chose its fights, its democratic fights, very carefully. But this kind of selectivity might actually be perfectly consistent with a consistent commitment to help other Greek cities become democracies when that was practicable. It's easy to say from this distance that a particular failure of Athens to force the issue on the democratic front shows that they weren't really committed to democracy as an ideological ideal, but there must often have been very good practical reasons not to intervene. Brock's article is an excellent source for exceptions to the idea that Athens' allies were all democracies. Samos, Miletus, Chalkis, for example, they were oligarchies for long periods, while they were also, we know, in the Athenian alliance. Brock's article is also a very good source for exceptions to the idea that cities that left the Athenian alliance always immediately stopped being democracies. So the citizens of Acanthus, for example, they even made the decision to leave Athens' alliance in 424 by the democratic method of a majority vote by secret ballot. But all of this, interesting though it is, it's to talk of exceptions. And as Brock himself admits, these don't necessarily affect the broader trends. So, what are the broader trends? One of the points, I guess, of this paper is to kind of draw attention to them and keep those in our minds, or bring those back into our minds. So one trend that Brock admits exists even for the period of the Peloponnesian War is one that Geoffrey de St. Croix pointed out as long ago as 1954 in his article on the character of the Athenian Empire. Reference is actually on the slide there. So if we analyze what Thucydides describes as happening rather than what Thucydides says is happening, or what Thucydides has his characters say about what's happening, then there's a clear overall pattern of the lower classes siding with Athens in the Peloponnesian War, seeking to set up democracies, getting support from Athens, and of aristocrats, oligarchs siding with Sparta, looking out for the next oligarchic regime, getting support when possible, from the Spartan side of the alliance. As we've seen, Brock admits that this pattern holds, with exceptions for the period of the Peloponnesian War, but he simply wants to point out, quite rightly again, that we shouldn't just retroject it onto earlier periods. So, is there a way that we can get at what the evidence can tell us about Athens' involvement in transitions to democracy for the whole of the classical period and maybe beyond, so throughout the archaic and classical periods, let's say? As I say, this paper here is a work in progress, but as a first step I turned to two books by Eric Robinson, the first Democracies from 1997 and Democracy Beyond Athens from 2011, in which Robinson has carefully surveyed all the evidence he could find about democratii across the whole of the archaic and classical periods, across the whole of the Greek world, where they were, what they were like, and most importantly for our purposes here, when and how they came into being. I myself tabulated the most securely established transitions to democracy described by Robinson, noting when another power, a city-state, a foreign empire, or a generalissimo like Alexander, when they were involved in the democratic transition. And I'll put a link to that spreadsheet that I made out of Robinson's work below. And you can see the results on this screen with Athens, which I counted as involved in 18 of the transitions to democracy described by Robinson, easily in the lead, well ahead of its nearest rival Syracuse, Syracuse has less than half the number of involvements in democratic transitions that Athens does. So that's worth dwelling on for just a second, but I'll now move on to this slide. Because Athens' involvement in democratic transitions overall isn't just distinguished by its frequency, but also by its geographical spread. In Democracy Beyond Athens, Robinson goes through the evidence in different chapters, each chapter devoted to a different part of the Greek world. So as you move down my spreadsheet, which I did just by moving through Robinson, you move through different parts of Greece, through eastern Greece, including coast of what's now Turkey, the Black Sea, etc. You move through the west, Sicily and southern Italy, the far west. And you can see the pattern pretty clearly from the cluster of democratic transitions in the top right of this slide. Now those are ones that involved Syracuse. Syracuse is number 8 in the system I used. And the reason that all those points cluster together for Syracuse is that all of the democratic transitions that Syracuse was involved in happened in the same region, in southern Italy and Sicily. Not surprising. Democratic Syracuse was involved in democratizing other cities, but only in its home region. And a similar point applies to number 3. You can see the similar pattern with number 3. Thebes, involved in many cities turning democratic, especially in the wake of Thebes' defeat of oligarchic Sparta at Leuctra in 371, after which they go into the Peloponnese and foster sort of anti-Spartan measures in various polis. So Thebes is definitely involved in that. But again, all of that involvement is confined to one region here, mainland Greece, really the Peloponnese mostly. If you look at number 1, though, now that's Athens. The only power I looked at that was involved in democratic transitions across the Greek world as a whole. And, well, it looks like 0 might be one, but 0 isn't actually polis. It's just all the transitions to democracy, which Robinson didn't find outside involvement in. So that's obviously something that's going to be evenly distributed. So I also know there's probably a better way of displaying this information, like on a map, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. So if you have suggestions on that front, then yeah, please put them in the comments. So as I've tried to make clear, but I want to make extra clear now, what I've shown you in the last slide isn't in the last couple slides, it's not a completely accurate representation of which powers were involved in every democratic transition that took place in the ancient Greek world. Basically because what we know of the evidence doesn't necessarily map on perfectly to what really happened, right? That's a familiar point in ancient history. So what this is it's just my count of who was involved in the transitions documented by Eric Robinson. And even those depend on imperfect sources that don't give us equally detailed narratives of every period and every area. As usual, we probably have more information about Athens' activities than other polis, and that's bound to affect the results. There's also the matter of which transitions I've tabulated. I've actually tried to include most of the cases noted in Robinson. Sometimes I followed his lead if he says this, I'm not so sure about this transition, it's so shadowy as to almost not be worth talking about. But mostly I've put them all in. So this isn't a perfect exercise, but I think it's worth doing nonetheless. It's only really by getting a sense of all the transitions to democracy that we know of in the ancient Greek world that we can see how significant Athens' role in promoting democracy really was, or we can get a sense of how significant it was or wasn't. The sources probably haven't given us equal coverage of every region or period, that's right, but it's worth pointing out that there are good clusters of transitions both in the West and in the Peloponnese that we do know of, and in well-documented periods, like the late 5th and the early 4th centuries BC, Athens still seems to be involved in an unusual number of democratic transitions. So even when we can see lots of democratic transitions with involvement from other polis, Athens still seems to be in the lead. As for my own tabulation of the data, though I could sometimes have included more cases, I don't think doing so would have done much to close the gap between Athens and its rivals. It wouldn't have changed the pattern that we see here that much. But of course, other scholars are free to repeat the exercise with Robinson's book, and you can see if you come up with a significantly different picture. I'm not saying that it's not a passive-aggressive thing. I mean it. In fact, I'd be delighted if someone else wanted to work back through Robinson in the way I have and check my work. That's Democracy Beyond Athens that I depended on, and the First Democracies. So in his book, The First Democracies, Robinson surveyed the evidence for democracy in the archaic period, looking closely at 18 possible cases and concluding that at least 11 were likely democratic. We can and should quibble with some of his cases, but it seems now very unlikely that the system set up by Cleisthenes after 508/7 in Athens was the first democracy of all in ancient Greece. The story that's still often told, for example, in Paul Cartledge's engaging recent Life of Democracy, in which Athens is the first democracy, and democracy spreads out from there, that's very likely to be false, and Robinson, I think, deserves a lot of credit for showing this. He also deserves great credit for documenting, along with, for example, Hansen and Nielsen's great compendium or inventory of archaic and classical Greek polis, that Athens was never really alone as a democracy in the Greek world, and it wasn't even that much of an outlier. So the idea that Athens invented democracy, they championed it nearly all on their own, and they succeeded in spreading it heroically, single-handedly to a batch of other city-states, that now looks impossible to sustain. And I think it's something that's been known within the field for a while, but it's sort of struggling to become more widely known. So Athenian democracy was actually a broader development. It was just one that Athens played some part in. Athens was a particularly large, influential democratic city-state, left more evidence. We think about it more, but there were other democracies out there. So all of this, as I've said, it now looks increasingly well established, and Robinson deserves credit for helping establish it. At the same time, there's a danger, I think, of downplaying what role Athens did have in spreading democracy. If democracy was a larger development Athens played some part in, the possibility is still open that it actually played a pretty significant part, which is, of course, what I'm trying to argue here. Robinson's extremely valuable compendium of all the more and less likely democracies of the classical Greek world allows him to present the two graphs here. Now, the first graph shows the number of certain and probable democratiae just in the Aegean, and the second the number in the rest of the Greek world, so minus the Aegean. And Robinson uses these to conclude that Athens cannot have been the key factor, his words, key factor in the spread of Greek democracy, since democracy spread outside of Athens' neighborhood just as quickly as it did within the city's sphere of influence. Right, so the shape of the graphs is the same whether you're looking at the Aegean, which you might expect has a lot of Athenian influence in the form of the Athenian League and the Athenian Empire. Pattern's the same there as it is other places in the Greek world where probably Athens didn't have that much influence. Therefore, it's not Athens that's the decisive factor in spreading Greek democracy. Now, we've actually seen that Athens was involved in a few transitions to democracy outside the Aegean, but that probably doesn't affect Robinson's point too much. And he is certainly looking at the big picture of the spread of Greek democracy, and he's not looking just at exceptions, and that's wonderful, too. As I've already indicated, I actually have no problem accepting Robinson's overall contention that Athens was just one driver of democracy in the Greek world among many, and the more important drivers were probably not even states, they were probably economic, social, or cultural factors, since they seem to affect the Greek world as a whole. Again, though, none of this should lead us, or need lead us, to the conclusion that Athens had no effect on the spread of Greek democracy. So though Athens didn't do that much to spread democracy outside of the Aegean, it was, as we've seen, very active in democratic transitions in the Aegean. So Robinson's comparison can show that it wasn't a sine qua non, it wasn't a necessary condition for the spread of Greek democracy. Greek cities could democratize without Athenian democracy, and they often, without Athenian involvement, and a lot of them did actually. But it remains the case that, though deeper factors were doubtless at play, Athens was the proximate cause for many democratic transitions in the Aegean. It's how it turned out in these individual cases that Athens played a role in these particular democratic transitions. And that's something we should bear in mind. So maybe the city wasn't the key factor. I agree with Robinson about that, but it did play a significant role. And actually, this is fully in line with the conclusion of Robinson himself, that Athens was only one of a set of what I'll call local champions that Robinson suggests played vital roles in instigating democratic revolution in their locale. So if I can add anything to this, it's just that we should bear in mind that Athens was, as we've already seen, I should stay with this graph, this slide. Athens was, as we've already seen, first among equals in this set of local champions. So just one among many local champions, but first among equals. If Syracuse prompted a few transitions to democracy in Sicily and Thebes a few more in the Peloponnese, Athens was a factor in a good number of transitions to democracy, and its area of operation was the entire Aegean region, and sometimes beyond. And that conclusion is based on the same evidence that Eric Robinson himself has so helpfully gathered for us. Okay, so speaking of conclusions, since I think I've already run out of time if this talk was actually taking place at the conference it was meant for, been booed off the stage by now. It's probably a good time for some more general conclusions. I think it's clear, and it's not even really disputed by either Brock or Robinson, to be fair, that Athens tended to ally itself with democracies, and that it was often involved in other cities becoming democracies. What I think I can add, besides sort of putting more emphasis on these trends rather than the exceptions, is that it's also pretty clear that if we're looking just at city-states or states and not at the more ultimate, larger scale causes, if we're looking at the states, then Athens clearly played the most significant role in spreading democracy among the polis. Did it do so consistently or as a matter of principle? Well, it's impossible to know that for sure. Robinson states squarely that no one makes this claim, and he means by that there's an absence of clear statements to this effect in the sources that survive to us. But I think we should remember there's also a near absence of democratic theory in the sources that survive to us. So, the great speech of Protagoras in Plato's dialogue is one of the only significant snatches of positive democratic theory. And there's plenty of anti-democratic theory that has survived in the work of Plato, Aristotle, and others. And none of that should make us conclude that Athenian democrats wouldn't have had anything to say in defense of democracy, or still less that they didn't actually see any reason to support democracy, or they didn't like it for ideological reasons. We have evidence that in fact they did. So in the 4th century, there was even a goddess Democratia who can be seen crowning the people of Athens in this famous decree on the slide, the decree of Eucrates of 337/6. We know that on 2 occasions, in 411 and 403, Athenians took concerted and violent action, dangerous action against oligarchic regimes in order to restore democracy in their homeland. So can we really rule out the idea that democracy as an ideology was ever a factor in the military interventions that the city conducted abroad? It's a city that we might recall, besides the apparent worship, sometimes in literal terms, of democracy at home, it had a worship called free speech, parrhesia. Now that's not to say that all Athenians always and without hesitation did everything to support or install democracies abroad. But I'd submit that the most natural reading of the evidence we have is that an ideological commitment did play a role in Athenian foreign policy, and that democratic Athenians tended to support popular rule when they could. Realpolitik obviously also played a big role in the decisions that they made, but to say that ideology played no role at all would be to espouse an extremely austere, and again, I think suspiciously Thucydidean account of human motivation. Realpolitik on its own doesn't do much to explain the proto-democratic bias we've seen in the evidence of Athenian military involvement over the whole of the classical period. So if I'm right, and Athens did try to promote democracy when it could, and that it stands to reason that the ideological commitment to the democratic majority played a role in that, What explains the skeptical take, which, as I said at the beginning, is now becoming the scholarly consensus? So one point of comparison that 5th century Athens sometimes brings up is the modern US, another state which has intervened militarily outside its borders, often with the stated intent of defending or spreading democracy. Sometimes, obviously, hypocritically, sometimes with more sincerity, but anyway, that claim has often been made. So Ryan, and this connection has often been made. So Ryan Ballett, for example, has an excellent book, Greek Political Thought, which I'm very happy to use in my teaching. Ryan Ballett compares Athenian rhetoric to that of the post-Cold War New World Order that came out of the US in the 1990s especially. Now, I don't want to assert that everyone who's written about Athenian foreign policy in the past few years has really been thinking about US foreign policy, not asserting that, certainly for Brock or Robinson. As I said in my first Heterodox Classics talk on a possible bias among classes against the idea of human nature, if the possible bias I'm warning about just isn't really there, then I'm happy, that's great. But I think it might be healthy to point out, just in case, that the recent US foreign policy and classical Athenian foreign policy are two different things. And it's possible to believe that Athens not infrequently spread democracy deliberately and by force and for ideological reasons, and at the same time you can also think that it hasn't been a good idea for the US to try to do that. In any case, in the final analysis, whatever our thoughts may be about US foreign policy, the ancient evidence is what it is, and we should focus above all on seeing what that tells us. Again, people are already doing this. That's wonderful. I think Brock and Robinson are, but I do wonder slightly about some of these connections and whether modern political considerations are sort of might be creeping into the way we look at the ancient evidence. I'm just flagging that, I guess. Okay, so I've argued here that it's reasonable to think that the ancient evidence tells us two things, in fact. First, Athens was a major factor in the spread of democracy in archaic and classical Greece. And second, even though other non-state factors, economic change and so on, were probably more important than any individual polis' activities, among Greek city-states, Athens was by far the most influential of them when it came to the diffusion of democracy. Now, obviously, I hope I've convinced you that I'm right, but if I haven't, then I'd be grateful for your comments and your criticism in the comments below. The reasoned disagreement is, after all, one of the main things that the Heterodox Academy is trying to promote and defend. And I'll just end, I guess, by reminding you that if you're an academic currently active in fields like classics or ancient history or classical archaeology, and you're interested in joining Heterodox Classics, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you.